Welcome to the Korea Society. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight for the first program in 2026 of the Hwang Family Foundation series on ethics and common values. In 2024, the Korea Society launched this new lecture and conversation series in order to promote an understanding of central themes of our human existence. Through this series of lectures and conversation with extraordinary individuals, we hope you'll be reminded of the timeless guiding principles and be inspired as we navigate the complex world we live in. This series is made possible with the generous support from the Hwang Family Foundation and its founder and chair, Mr. Hwang. Mr. Hwang has been a close friend and supporter of the Korea Society for many years, and we are once again grateful for the generosity of Mr. Hwang and the board members of the Hwang Family Foundation as we continue this series for the third year. If you'd like to find out how you can help the Korea Society, please visit koreasociety.org, subscribe to our emails, and or follow us on various social media platforms. And finally, this evening, we are delighted to welcome Rabbi Angela Buchdahl. Rabbi Buchdahl serves as the senior rabbi of Central Synagogue in New York City and is the first woman to lead Central's Reform congregation in its 185 years history. Rabbi Buchdahl's memoir, Heart of a Stranger, which all of you received, was released in October 2025 and became an instant New York Times bestseller. Joining Rabbi Buchdahl on stage for our conversation is Kyung Yoon, the president and CEO, as well as a co-founder of the Korean American Community Foundation and a contributing reporter to CUNY TV's Asian American Life. And we look forward to their conversation. Please welcome Rabbi Angela Buchdahl and Kyung Yoon.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jay, and it is such a delight to be here tonight with my friend and my inspiration, Rabbi Angela Buchdahl.
Thank you.
And I have to say, I'm so proud to call you also my Korean-American sister. It's complicated, right? Because I think we have had many conversations around what is identity and what is it to be a Korean American or Jewish American or a Jewish person. And as we think about, as Jay said, navigating America or this world and the times that we live in. So thank you, Mr. Hwang, for creating this wonderful platform for us to hear from Rabbi Buchdahl and to just kind of parse out some of these questions together. And I think I feel very lucky to have as a foundation for this that your book, and that was so reflective, and that we can actually, and I actually want to start with a question about the title, The Heart of a Stranger. And I think for many of us as Korean immigrants in this country, we have felt what it means to be a stranger, and what is the path to feeling like you belong and that this is home for us. And so I'd love to ask you about your thoughts on that and why you picked this title. And you can start. I'm sorry I didn't.
Thank you, Kyung. I feel very lucky to be doing this with Kyung, who is my Korean 언니, I would say, and especially because I've been a part of the Jewish community and a leader in the Jewish community for almost 3 decades now in the New York area. But I never addressed the Korean community until I got the invitation from Kyung in 2017 to address the KACF Giving Summit. And since then, KACF has been my Korean home in New York, which has really been meaningful to me. But I rarely get to speak in kind of Korean settings. So I'm very honored to be here at Korea Society. I have been here once before. I got to see an amazing Bojagi exhibit that was here a couple of years ago, which was beautiful. But it always feels very special for me when I have an opportunity to kind of reflect also on my Korean side. So I was born in Seoul. My father ended up in Korea in the 1960s because he did ROTC to pay off college loans, and the Army placed him in Korea. He met my mother, who was studying English literature, and she and her Iwa women who were all studying with her convinced my father to do a conversational English class. And so they started taking a weekly class, and every week someone dropped out of the class until it was just my mom and my dad. And so I guess that was the love story. They fell in love, even though they came from incredibly different backgrounds. And my mother was born in Japan under the occupation of Korea from Japan, ended up herself an immigrant back to her homeland when she was about 5, and grew up in a tiny town called Hyungpung. Anyway, so I grew up my first 5 years in this very wonderful Korean bubble of all my emos, and like my mother was from a family of 7 children and lots of cousins, and even though, as you probably know, in Korea there's a lot of stigma to be a biracial Korean, I felt within my family very embraced. But then I came to America when I was 5 to Tacoma, Washington, which is where my father's family was from. Not a big Jewish community, 300 families, so like a tiny Jewish community, and ended up going to kindergarten about 6 months after I arrived. I didn't speak a lot of English because I only spoke Korean when I was in Korea. And my mom packed me seaweed lunches, which did not help. And so the kids all said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Korea." And they were like, "Okay." And then I went back to Korea for my summer vacation. And all the Korean kids said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm 한국 사람. I'm from Korea." And they said, "No, you're not." And I remember this feeling, even as a very young girl. I was 7 years old, and I ran to my mother and I cried and I said, "I don't belong anywhere. I don't have a home." And my mother, in her, I think, Buddhist wise way, said, "Home is wherever your people are. You can make any place your home." And that's a wonderful thing to say, and she really helped me try to find that. But lots of people don't always agree with that. So you can decide that, and people can still say, "Oh, but you don't really belong." So while I had this biracial identity where I didn't feel like I was fully Korean because I had this American father, and I didn't feel, in some ways, I felt like my American identity was always going to be hyphenated. I was always going to be Korean American, and I present this way. And then, of course, I entered the Jewish community because I have a Jewish father, and he wanted me to be raised in the Jewish community, and my mother agreed. So we started at the synagogue that my father was already, his family had been there for almost 100 years. So I had, in some ways, deep roots in Tacoma and in the Jewish community. But as you might imagine, my Korean American Jewish family didn't look like any other family in the synagogue. And while my rabbi embraced us and the community embraced us and were really welcoming of my mother, there were plenty of people in the Jewish community who said, "But you're not really Jewish. You don't, and even people who were well-meaning, they'd say, 'Oh, that's funny. You don't look Jewish,' which is like a line that Jews say all the time. And, the thing is, when you hear it 500 times, it's not so funny anymore. And it's a constant reminder that you're othered, that you don't really belong, that you don't really have a place there. So I didn't know where I fit in. And there was a part of me that always felt like this was my burden to carry, that I didn't feel like I was ever fully a part of any single community. But maybe my mother tried to help me, and my father, that actually I could be a part of any community I wanted to be a part of. And there was some sense that I was always an outsider, and I found a way home. I'll just quickly say the reason I called this book The Heart of a Stranger. It's not an original title. It comes from the Torah, or from the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. And it is actually tomorrow night. The festival of Passover begins in the Jewish community. This is the time when we tell the story, not of when our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, but we were actually commanded to say we were slaves in Egypt. We were supposed to remember what it was like to be slaves in Egypt, so that the Torah says, "Remember, do not oppress the stranger, because you were the stranger. You know the heart of a stranger. You were slaves in Egypt." So this memory of knowing what it's like to be an outsider is kind of the primary story of Passover. But it's not just the story of being slaves in Egypt. I would even say it's the first story of the origin of the Jewish people. So do you know the first two Hebrews in the Bible are Abraham and Sarah? If you're a Christian or Muslim, Abraham and Sarah are also your early ancestors. We are all the children of Abraham and Sarah if you belong to those faiths. Anyway, how did Abraham and Sarah begin the Hebrew people? God calls them and says, you must leave your birthplace, leave your homeland, leave everything behind, and go to a place you do not know, and you will be a blessing. And so when Abraham and Sarah leave their homeland and cross over the river, they cross over. That word in Hebrew, ivri, it comes from the word to cross over. So literally to be a Hebrew is to be a boundary crosser. And why does God need the Jewish people to start their religion not in their homeland? It's because they have to know the heart of a stranger. So for most of my life, I felt that I had to apologize or feel burdened and pained by the fact that I always felt like I was a stranger in every place I belonged. At some point, I realized this was the most Jewish thing about me. And actually, while I saw it as my burden in that, like, how did I became the rabbi despite the fact that I was Korean, despite the fact that I was a woman. At some point I realized, no, it's actually exactly because I know what it feels like to be the stranger and the outsider that it gave me a kind of empathy and understanding of others. I didn't presume that people belonged. It made me less judgmental in some way. And I think that in some ways has become the superpower. I'm making a very long answer, but it's a
No,
big,
it's
I'm giving you the whole background here. But I would just say that what's been interesting is I did a 2-month book tour when I launched the book and took a sabbatical. So I went to 27 cities and I did 45 talks. And I spoke with another Korean community with Kyung in LA, which was really a highlight. But it was mostly to Jewish audiences that I was speaking. And it was amazing to me that there were Jews who were Asian Jews and Black Jews and Hispanic Jews. And of course, they came to me and said, oh, this story resonates for me because, I'm a Jew of color. And I loved hearing these stories. It was very meaningful to me, but not surprising. But what was more surprising is to hear many, many Jews who look Jewish and who have 2 Jewish parents and who grew up in Jewish communities. And they said, well, I might look like I fit in, but I want to tell you why I feel like I'm also an outsider. And they had their own story. And I guess part of what I would say is it's not just a Jewish story. From Abraham to the slaves in Egypt to 2,000 years of being a diaspora people. I think it is the human story, honestly. And I think if you're an Asian American, I don't have to tell you that this has been a time of increased hatred and misunderstanding of the Asian community in America, especially post-pandemic. And I think that if you're African American, you still feel like we have not really reckoned with the racist history of our own country and still where we need to make progress. And I guess, as Jews in New York, I think my community feels more anxious than it's felt in a long time. So maybe this is, and I would even say that white Christian men in America feel like strangers in America and misunderstood. So maybe actually, instead of seeing this as our dividing point, that we actually see that this is our first point of human connection. Tell me your story of why you feel like you're an outsider. Maybe that'll be the way that we connect. That's the invitation of the book.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful invitation. At the same time, I think we all see the world through our eyes, right, and our lens. And then I think there are just blind spots that each of us have. Because sometimes if you are just, I actually felt that when I was speaking to a Korean American who was adopted. And I just, because I know who my parents are. Like, I kind of know where I come from. And then sometimes I don't feel I belong, but I kind of know where I'm. But she pointed out to me that, like, she really doesn't have that either. And so there's all sorts of, blind spots. And when I was reading your book and your story, you actually have like layer upon layer of like different empathy that I think, your journey brought you to. But I want to go back to your mother and about being a student at Ihwa, and then falling in love with an American, and there were and I think I read in the book that your dad had to promise your mom, promise
My
her
how many?
mom,
Yeah.
that he wasn't going to take her out of Korea. So that's why you wound up being born there and
Yeah.
lived there. So tell us a little bit about that. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, I probably don't have to tell you that there was a lot of suspicion of American men who ended up marrying Korean women in Korea. And I think my mother's mother, was not particularly excited about the fact that my mom was falling in love with my dad. And he was Jewish on top of that, which was very foreign. And so she did not approve of the marriage. And she had a whole arranged marriage with a nice Korean doctor for my mother. But my mother was not interested. So my father, one of the things he did was he really learned how to speak Korean so that he could speak to my Halmoni, and which was important because he ended up living in Korea for 10 years and my first language was Korean. So he said it, and he promised my grandmother, he said, I will not take your daughter out of Korea while you're, I'll not take her away from you. And he kept that promise. Unfortunately, my grandmother died when I was only 4.5 years old. And so at that point, I think my mother and my father understood that there was going to be a kind of stigma as a biracial child for me in Korea, especially in the 70s. I think you probably know that there was a lot it was really a second-class status. I don't think that biracial men could go into the army until like 2007 or something like that. There was you weren't a citizen. And there was just all sorts of ways that there was bullying, and the rate of unemployment and mental illness and suicide amongst biracial Koreans in Korea is so high. My mother and also my father really wanted to raise us as a Jewish family, and that was almost impossible in Korea. So we came.
So you and your sister.
So my sister,
sister.
my parents, our entire family moved to where my father was. But yes, but my mother, she was quite remarkable because even though she left Korea, Korea never left her. So while she was in America, she brought over her sisters' families, and each of them, after she settled, she brought over 3 of her sisters and then one of my uncles as well. And then she became an ESL teacher, English as a second language, and her first decade of students were all Korean immigrant students. And so she helped hundreds of Korean immigrants as they came. Then the students became Cambodian and Vietnamese, and then they were Russian over her 30 years of teaching ESL. And she also, most importantly, started the Korean Women's Association with a group of maybe 5 or 6 founders. It started with 30 Korean women in someone's living room just needing to sing Korean songs and eat Korean food together and commiserate about America in the beginning. And then there were a few women who had suffered from a woman who told a story of suffering from domestic violence and feeling like she didn't have anywhere to go. So she said, we've got to start a domestic violence shelter. She realized this was more pervasive. Then it became, we have a lot of elderly Koreans who don't have someone to help them with, cooking for them and whatever else. So they started that. I'm going to fast forward and say 30 years later, KWA has I think a $35 million budget. It is the second largest social service organization in Washington state, and they serve way beyond the Korean community. And that started as 30 Korean women just needing to have social, ties with each other. And my mother was behind that as well as a president of KWA for many, many, many years. So I saw my mother create a sense of home by welcoming in those who were even more stranger than she was. And so this was actually part of the story as well.
Yeah, because you were saying that you saw your mother, in her immigration to the U.S. and not speaking English fluently initially, and also sort of not fitting in, right, with the Jewish community or or in Tacoma.
Yeah.
And yet, she, being a stranger, kind of like Abraham in the Bible.
That's right.
Was so welcoming of other strangers, and that is how she became American in a way, right?
Yeah, when she welcomed her sisters, it's interesting how she knew how to like sign up for the school forms, and she knew where the Korean grocery stores were. And so she became the American. And that is, you realize that when you feel like you don't belong, when you reach out to the next generation or the next one that comes after you and you pull them in, it not only helps them feel more belonging, but it transforms you as well. And, I watched my mom do that. She became almost like an obsessive welcomer her whole life. And I think that really takes root with this also because she's a pretty extraordinary person. But I think also it came from this feeling that she really knew what it was like to be ignored. And I watched my brilliant mother, people would talk to her as if she were less intelligent because of her accent, and or sometimes treat her like she was invisible. And as a child, a policeman would turn to me and say, "Can you tell your mother blah 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 blah?" And it would make me so angry. And I would say, like, "My mother speaks English, thank you very much." And I would feel so angry, and my mother somehow never lost her dignity in that. But I know that she wanted to make sure that there was a different experience for the next generation.
Yeah, and I think that is also very universal. That is kind of an immigrant's journey too, that sometimes in my work with the Korean American Community Foundation, where we're trying to build philanthropic giving and more kind of infrastructure around that, and there can be this narrative somehow that Koreans don't give, or that they're not generous people or something. But I find actually that Koreans are very generous. I mean, if you look at the mutual aid and how, the Korean American Association of Greater New York, or how different affinity groups, like they gave each other credit, when the banks wouldn't give them credit. I mean, that is the journey of an immigrant, like putting down stakes. And I say, and that's where the empowerment also comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that it's just finding your generosity, finding your agency, because it's initially when you're just trying to survive, it's about how do I get a foothold in this country. But as you move, then it's how do I give? How do I help others? And I remember from your talk at the Giving Summit for the Korean community, because we were kind of looking at like Jewish, traditions of philanthropy that seems to be so much more evolved, than when we're just trying to find. But you pointed out also how generous your mother was, and but you talked about values that were very aligned for you between your father's Jewish culture and your mom's Korean culture. But then there were some differences. So maybe you could talk about that. Yeah.
So, I mean, I grew up middle class, and somehow my mom was a teacher, a school teacher, and my dad was an architect. But I would just say that it felt like there were often gaps between one job to the next job, and it wasn't so. We didn't have a lot of money. Somehow my parents made me feel like anything I wanted, I could have piano lessons and I could have ballet lessons, but I knew money was tight. So it was always interesting because my mom, my dad, it was like really he wasn't a religious Jew, and I'm not sure he ever talked about God, but his Judaism was very much what his identity was, and he did it through deeds. So one of the things I watched him do, like once a month, he would sit at his desk and he would take all these charitable giving request envelopes, back when people would give you all those envelopes, and he would write checks like they were really small, $5 and $10. This was in the 1970s and 80s. And he would write, March of Dimes, $10, and, the Tacoma Youth Symphony, and all these little, multiple sclerosis society. And my mom would say, "We don't have money. Why are you giving money to multiple sclerosis? We don't know anybody with multiple sclerosis." And my dad would say, "No, this is justice," meaning there's the Jewish word for charity is tzedakah, and it literally is from the same root as justice, because the idea is you actually have to balance the scales, and that's actually your obligation. It's not about whether or not you feel charitable. You actually are obligated to just give. And so while we didn't have a lot of extra money, he was always doing that. Meanwhile, I remember the first trip back to Korea that I actually remember, my mom must have spent $500, which seemed like a very big fortune at the time, on Estee Lauder cosmetics. And I was like, a suitcase of Estee Lauder cosmetics for all my emos back in Korea. And I was like, "Mom, I thought you said we don't have any money." She's like, this is for the emos. This is, now K beauty is much better than Estee Lauder,
Yes.
but back then Estee Lauder was the gold standard, and so it wasn't that my mother wasn't immensely generous. It was directed towards your loved ones, your family, your tribe, and my mother did that with both with literally her family, but also the way that she felt very. She would give money to her Korean students who didn't have money when they needed it, or the fact that she directed it to KWA. So there was a real sense that you have to kind of take care of your own first in a way, and which I appreciated. And then there was immense generosity around that. Whereas for my father, I think there was more a sense that we're riding the scales of justice, and so it was different. And so I think that, I don't know if this resonates for Koreans or Jews out there, but I would say that that was one kind of yes, stereotypical difference I think I saw between the real generosity, but kind of the different ways it was directed and how you thought about who was in your responsibility of who you had to serve and care for.
But growing up with your parents, you found actually there was quite a lot of alignment in the values that you were taught. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, both of my parents revered their mothers and their parents in general. Both of my parents were hugely lifelong learners. They modeled that you learn because learning is what life is about, and education was at the center of it all. And yes, my mom was kind of a tiger mom, there's this joke, she didn't say it, but she could have been. She's like, "You're Asian, not Bayesian," meaning you don't get a B on your report card. You're an Asian.
Not Bayesian.
Okay, not Bayesian. And the idea that if there was a missing 2 points, where are the 2 points? It's a 98. So, but they had very high expectations, but both of my parents did, and both of them really valued that. And I think also this sense that there's a value to tradition, that there's something that is passed on. There must be something very valuable and worthy in it. And so those were values that were very similar that both of my parents had. My dad also really, really loved Korean culture and Korean language and Korean food. And I think if he could have been Korean, he wanted to be. So he got the next best thing. He had a Korean family, and he still talks about how much he loves Korea all the time. And so I think that there was a real sense that they respected and loved each other and each other's cultures. My mother also was very involved in my Jewish life. While she remained Buddhist, she would come to synagogue with us. She learned how to make gefilte fish from my grandmother, which was a thing. And so I think that there was a real sense of we're bringing together two ancient, beautiful cultures. And my mom would always say, you take the best of both worlds.
And at the same time, did you identify more with one than another? I mean, or did you?
I mean, let's talk about my younger life. In my younger life, I felt like I was always toggling between my Korean and Jewish sides. And it always did feel like if I was in the Jewish community, it was like my Koreanness was subsumed. And when I was in the Korean community, and by the way, in Tacoma and Seattle ended up being one of the largest Korean communities in America. I think it's fourth or fifth largest Korean community. There are over 30,000 Koreans in the area. So I had 30,000 Koreans around. I only had 300 Jews. So there were way more Koreans than Jews around. And my mom, as I said, was part of Korean Women's Association and taught Korean students. And I had all my emos, and their extended families and Korean cousins. So I was constantly in a Korean environment, not to mention that I went back to Korea 4 or 5 times in the summertime to visit the rest of the family that was still in Korea. So I felt highly Korean identified, not to mention that I walk through the world and people always see me as Korean. But when I was in the Korean community, I couldn't be Jewish. It was not computing. And of course, to make it even more complicated, all of my mom's family was raised Buddhist, but my mother's sister, she became involved in the Korean church because socially that was where the Korean community was. And then she got very ill, and when she got better, she really believed that it was her faith in Christ that helped her get through. And so she became a born again Christian and became a minister. And she ran a Korean church. So she convinced two of my other sisters to convert to Christianity too. Her sisters. So 3 of my emos became Christian, and one of them was really, really like a deeply believing minister. And so my mom was the only one who remained Buddhist. So I had this Jewish side of the family, I had my Buddhist mother, and I had my Korean emos that were all telling me that I had to believe in Jesus. So it was really like something to kind of grow up with all of that. And I don't want to dismiss it. Like, I think that this faith was important to all of them. But it was a little bit like I was suspicious of anyone who said they had the monopoly on truth. And that went for Jews as well. And I think that in the best way, because I loved my family and they loved me too, and I felt that, I kind of understood that God could speak in lots of languages, and that there was not one way that was the only right way. There was actually human questions that religion wanted to answer about why are we here? How do we survive the suffering of our lives? What happens to us when we die? How do we make our lives purposeful? I think that every religion is trying to answer those questions. They might have different vocabularies, different pathways, but that's what we're all trying to get to in some way. And I think having this mixed up, crazy religious family of all these different kinds actually helped me understand and appreciate that more.
So then that was
But Minister
as a
Emo
younger.
gets her own chapter in the book. She was really something.
But then as an adult, later, you came, you left
So then I would
Tacoma.
say that,
Yeah.
yes, that once I went to college,
Yeah.
I leaned into my Jewish identity. Then I went to rabbinical school. And then in this weird way, my life narrowed to being so much in the Jewish community that I almost didn't have, like, I don't really have until more recently a Korean community at all in New York, which has a very big Korean community. And I think that it was also funny to me that, like, I now lead a synagogue, which I think it might be the largest synagogue in the world, which is kind of crazy that you've got a Korean woman leading the largest Jewish synagogue in the world. And we have 10,000 members, and I get asked to speak in front of Jewish audiences all the time. And but I've only spoken to a Korean crowd maybe twice. This is like maybe my third time in my life. And there's some way that I don't really know. I think it's because I'm so enmeshed in the Jewish world that my Korean world narrowed. And my family still lives in Tacoma and Seattle, and so they all came out when I went on my book tour out to Seattle, but they don't live here, and I didn't know how to have my way in. So I've been slowly working on that. But and Kyung, you've been a part of it, and it's part of why I was so excited to do this talk here at the Korea Society.
Well, we're so excited and proud of you. And I remember during COVID, when you called me, because after the murder of the massage parlor workers in Atlanta,
Asian workers, yeah.
You felt that you needed to speak about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really could feel that you, as a Korean American, and like 5 out of the 6 women who died were Korean Americans, they were Asian Americans, and I just could see how deeply, that you identified with that as well. And so I just thank you, like, for being a voice, for not, for all the identities that you carry, but also being so proud of your Korean American heritage. And yeah,
I really do. And can I share one story that was really interesting for me? So I feel deeply connected to Korea, and still have gone back to Korea many times. And in fact, my book begins and ends with Korea, actually. And it ends with a trip to Korea on my mom's 80th birthday. I went with her and my daughter, and 3 generations we went to Korea. But the second to last chapter is this crazy story where I'll just say that in the Jewish community, the terror attack that happened in Israel on October 7th was the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and it was deeply impactful for the Jewish community, and it continues to have reverberations, and it was very painful, and the war was really difficult and terrible, and I'm pained by what happened in Gaza and the Palestinian suffering as well. But this is but there was a way that it felt like the world, especially the academic world, was closing down for Jews and in particular for Israelis. I don't know if you know that there already were boycotts of Israeli academics before October 7th, but after October 7th, almost every university, and not just in like places like Columbia or other places, but there were boycotts of Israeli academics all around the world. There was only one place that I know of post October 7th that actually opened an Israel program at a university, and that was improbably at Seoul National University. Seoul National University planned to open an Israel Education Research Center. You know, I don't have to tell you that Seoul National is a flagship public university of Korea, and they plan to open it in November of right after October 7th, whatever that year was. Now I'm losing track of my years. But anyway, they decided not to do it a month after October 7th. So they decided they were going to open it 6 months later. And I had the honor of being asked to speak to be the keynote address at the opening of the Israel Center at Seoul National University. Wow. And so my parents, they were like exploding with excitement. They're like, we're coming. You know, my dad is 84 and he doesn't travel well, but he's like, I'm going to Korea for you to do that. Because in some way, this idea that their daughter, the Jewish rabbi who's Korean, speaking at Seoul National for the opening of an Israel Center was like the epitome of like why they married and made a family. And so they were so excited. They're like, we're coming. My sister was like, well, I'm going to come too. And my niece came, and it was just this incredible experience. And almost all my life, I either had to be Jewish and not Korean, or I had to be Korean and not Jewish. But for the first time in my life, I was in Korea because I was a rabbi. And I felt like all of my identities were there. And in some ways, I felt like maybe my whole life is for this moment to be a bridge between these communities. And in some way, it was really one of the most moving moments of my life to do that. And I had my Korean family show up for this event and everything else. And I think that there is something about deeply wanting this sense of home. And for that moment, I felt belonging in all the complexity of my identities. Yes. And I think that that's what we want, is we want to feel that we belong and we're whole, not just with one piece of our identity, but who we are in our fullness. That's what we're all seeking. And I got a glimpse of that when I went back to Korea.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I want to give an opportunity for people in the audience who might have questions for Rabbi Buchdahl. I think they're coming up with microphones.
A microphone just because of the live stream.
Thank you very much. My name is Hwang. My office is around here, so I do go into Korea Society events quite often, and I was really excited to hear you're coming. I'd heard about you first from my close colleague who's Jewish and was actually a member of your congregation, and really excited to have you here. My question is, you mentioned earlier about the monopoly of truth, some people thinking that way. And I know that I remember hearing a very inspirational sermon by you last year. I think it was about, Ishmael and Hagar and showing grace. So that was, I think, an excellent sermon. But something I thought about is as a head rabbi, senior rabbi, you must deal with a lot of different people with different views, I'm sure. And just more generally, I mean, how do you sort of address people who might have very different perspectives, but very strong views that their views of truth, be it political, religious, because this is something that I'm Christian, I go to church, and I also, when I talk to some people, then I hear some very strong views, and although I'm not like a clerk or anything, I mean, it's just very difficult to sort of deal with that. So any sort of, experience would be interested of hearing that. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So this might be one of the differences between the Korean and Jewish community that I notice. I think that there is a real sense in the Korean community that you wouldn't, there's really impolite to like disagree with someone in public, and especially someone that would be your elder or your, superior. That's not the way in the Jewish community. I don't know if you've heard this joke. If you have 2 Jews, you'll have 3 opinions. The idea is that, like, and not only that, but there's a sense that, like, you're almost encouraged to challenge, and you can challenge your superiors. That's both good and bad. So as a rabbi, I am not immune to my congregation like constantly telling me what they think I'm either doing well or wrong. And right now, I don't have to tell you that we are in a deeply polarized time. And in my community, I will say that I'm very proud that my community has really a huge ideological, political diversity within it. I say that I'm proud because I think that there are very few spaces left in America where Republicans and Democrats will socialize with each other together anymore, or where people who have very different views on Israel and the Jewish community, they don't want to be in the same room. If you're kind of like angry at Israel and you can't stand what they're doing and you're an anti-Zionist, you can't be in the room with the person who's like, I'm pro-Israel, or vice versa. This has been a major split in the Jewish community as well. I've got all of that in my congregation, partly because it's big, but partly because we have managed to create a space where we lift up that having difference of opinion is actually something that makes us better, that makes us more intellectually honest, that makes us actually have to challenge and sharpen our views. So I'll just tell you that there is, my mom, when she studied for that, whatever that exam is to get into college in Korea, that one big exam that everyone has to take, she actually went and studied at a Buddhist temple for 6 months to study for that exam. That model of going to away, a monk in a mountain that is by themselves and studying, that's a Korean or Buddhist model. That is not a Jewish model. You should never study in Judaism by yourself. The model is you study in what's called a Hevruta, which is a study pair. Like, you're always supposed to study text with somebody else. And the ideal Hevruta, or study partner, is it possible to get a little bit of water? I've got a little tickle. But the ideal Hevruta is someone who disagrees with you, who challenges your views. And so there's this story of this famous rabbi who was the head of the academy, and this guy who was basically like a former bandit who was like really street smart, but like not at all learned in the same traditional way. They were Hevruta, and they would challenge each other all the time. Thank you so much. And anyway, the story goes that they got in a big argument, and the one rabbi insulted his Hevruta, and the Hevruta got so upset that he died. Anyway, then this is like a rabbinic legend. And then they bring in this brilliant guy and they say, oh, we've got a new study partner for you, Rabbi. And this guy, every time the rabbi made an argument, the Hevruta would say, I have the proof text for it. I'll show you. Anyway, at a certain point, this rabbi gets very exasperated and he goes, I don't need you to tell me I'm right. I already know I'm right. He said, my old Hevruta, my old study partner, every time I made an argument, he would give me 26 reasons I was wrong. And he said, and that would make me crazy, but my argument got so much better because of it. And we both got to a better answer because of it. So this is a Jewish value. And because of that, it's extremely challenging for me to lead my congregation right now. But I frame it as actually that we have the Jewish spiritual technology for how we're supposed to argue with each other respectfully and in a way that makes us all better and get closer to truth. So when I see it that way, then it's actually our benefit, not our problem that we are so diverse. That doesn't make it easy, I'll just say that, but I do think that we frame it in that way, and that is one of the ways we've been able to manage to hold this diverse community together. That and finding ways to transcend our differences and remind us of what unites us. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is just to sing together or to serve people a meal together. I'll tell you, if you've served a homeless, we serve 3 days a week. We serve 200 meals to people who are homeless in Midtown Manhattan. If you serve a meal with someone, you might vote differently, but you can't think that person is a horrible person. You might say, I disagree with your politics, but you at least think you can't demonize them the same way. So that's part of the goal of like what religious community should be all about.
Thank you so much for this really illuminating but also very joyful conversation. I love talking or hearing you talk about being a bridge. So thank you for being in that bridge and also referencing both the challenges contemporaneously facing the Jewish community as well as the Korean American community. And I was wondering if there is something that you see that the Jewish community is doing really, really well that we could take as the Korean American community?
So I think that one of the things that the Jewish community has done well that has maybe been even amplified in the last couple of years is that we're really good at educating the next generation about what it is that really makes our values deep and lasting, and then creating ritual around it that helps it become sticky. One of the things I struggled with, and believe me, have plenty of both Korean mother guilt and Jewish mother guilt about, is that if you ask me, so how do your children feel Korean? Now they're quarter Korean, but I feel deeply Korean. If I were to tell you, I would say, well, my children eat a lot of, they love Korean food. I would tell them Korean folk tales, which was a big way that my mother transmitted Korean culture, was through a lot of Korean folk tales. She would tell me all the time, we've been to Korea with them many times. But it's a little bit thin. That it's sort of like if you would have told me that's the way that someone's Jewish, I would say that's not sufficient, meaning like they eat bagels and they've been to Israel and they hear some Jewish Bible stories. That to me is like a little bit, but it's not quite enough because I don't have the infrastructure of the Korean community and holidays that help make it. So like one of the things that's interesting is like when you have a Passover Seder, when you have a holiday like that, it's not just that you're telling the story of the Exodus, you're reliving it and you're eating and ingesting the tears and the bread of affliction. And there's something about how the ideas become embodied in some way when you have the ritual around it that helps it. So I feel like I've done a much worse job of transmitting it. And I think if you talk to other Koreans I know, and I know a few, they would say it is harder to transmit Korean culture outside of Korea, aside from the things that I just mentioned, some of the stories, the food, the language. How do you transmit the cultural pieces? And I do think that we are helped by the fact that we have like really firm holidays and kids go to Hebrew school. I know some Koreans go to a Korean school and they usually learn the language, and the language is also a bridge in a way that you feel connected. I'm happy to say that while my children, each in their own way, have connected to Korea, my middle son in particular, he really fell in love with Korea, and he was supposed to be a college freshman when the pandemic hit, and he said, I'm not going to go to college on Zoom. So he said, I'm going to go to Korea because Korea did the pandemic much better in the beginning than everybody else did. And so he went to Korea for a semester. He was actually able to go to a class. He went 8 hours a day of Korean instruction. So he became fluent in Korean. He did that for a whole semester. And he was in Korea, he was still able to go to baseball games. They could go to baseball games and then when everybody else was in lockdown. And so he got to spend time with my Korean cousins. Then when he went to college, he continued taking his Korean studies and then did another summer at Yonsei and learned even more Korean for 3 more months. So he also, he said, Mom, learning the language and spending time in Korea and knowing my Korean family, he says, now I really get to claim my Koreanness. So also that was a reminder that it's never too late. Like he did that as a 18-year-old is when he started that. And so I think that but I do think that the Jewish community has taught kids how to read Hebrew because of a bar mitzvah and done things that help them feel that deep identification, which I think is really key.
Well, and speaking of culture, I just want to actually
Ask me
proffer a little treat for all of you tonight, because you might say that you don't have a lot of Korean culture, but at our KACF Giving Summit, one of the most emotional moments for us was when Angela led us in singing a Korean folk song together. And so, she actually started at Central Synagogue as the cantor and has a beautiful voice. And we just thought that maybe we could close out this evening with listening to Angela, but also maybe singing Arirang together.
Yeah.
So, Angela.
Do people have time for me to do 2 songs? I might do 2 songs. I'm going to end with Arirang because I want to end with us singing. But I'm going to do one more. This I'll consider the Jewish song. You will probably not think of this as a Jewish song, but when I was the end of my book, I end up in Korea and actually go with my mom and my daughter and 2 of my emos to a Buddhist meditation center and a temple, basically, the one that my mom studied at outside of Daegu, which has like the biggest Buddha statue that exists or something. Anyway, we went to a meditation retreat, and at some point, my emo is bragging to the monk and says, my niece, she's she's a rabbi and she met the president of the United States. And so the monk had never met Jewish person before, ever. And so he said, well, will you tell us a little bit about Judaism? So like standing on one foot with my mom translating, I basically explained the story I told you about Abraham and Sarah and about how they had to leave their birthplace to start this religion and to be a blessing to the wider world. And as I'm telling this story, my mother, I see tears in her eyes because it's not just the story of Abraham and Sarah. That's also my mother's story. She had to leave her birthplace and in some ways leave what she knew behind in order to go to a place she didn't know to become who she would become. And it's also, of course, my story as well. I left my birthplace. And so anyway, there is this very existential Jewish longing for home. It is what an exilic people always feels. If you are a diaspora people, you're always longing for home. Well, there is a famous song that was written by two Jews, and it's all about the longing for home. There's no place like home. They were two Tin Pan Alley Jewish songwriters. One of them was the son of a cantor. So while you might think of this as a song that comes from a famous musical, I would say that this is maybe the most important Jewish prayer of exile that's ever been written, about no place like home. So this is somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me, somewhere over the rainbow. Skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh, why can't I? Thank you. So this was the song I sang at the temple, and my emo turned to my mom and said, I feel like our parents are here, and I think they understand now why you had to leave. So that was that song. Okay, so, okay, I'm going to need you to sing this with me, those of you who know it, and I know you do. Arirang, arirang, arario, 아리랑 고개를 넘어간다. 나를 버리고 가신 하시는 님은 심리도 못 가서 발병 난다. 야리라라리랑 아라리요 아리랑 고개를 넘어간다. Thank you.